Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Jonathan Carter. I'm a PM on the Visual Studio team, and I'm excited to talk with y'all today about how we can remain productive as developers while working remotely, which is something that likely all of us are thinking deeply about right now. So over the course of the next 30 minutes, I want to talk about really two key points. The first is, what is it that traditionally we as developers face when trying to remain productive while remote? And then more importantly, how is it that we can overcome these challenges? And we'll show that and talk to that through the lens of a day in the life demo of a remote developer. And then we'll save plenty of time at the end to do some Q&A and talk about remote development in general. So when we talk about being productive, through the lens of this discussion, the way that I want to define that is how do we ensure that when a developer on a team starts on a new project, takes on a new task, or works on a bug or user story, that we get them from zero to kind of contribution or deploying to staging or production as fast as we humanly can, right? Because we know that many organizations are trying to accelerate their release velocity, and therefore the definition of productivity is really getting from identifying value for a customer and then being able to actually deliver it for that customer. And so when we think about things that can impact us from achieving that productivity, particularly while we're remote, there's two key areas that I want to talk about today. The first is onboarding and the cost that typically is associated with it when we start on a new project or a task, right? We're probably all familiar with the fact that the complexity around installing SDKs, build tools, like dependencies needed just to get started can often take us hours or days before we're even at the point where we're writing a single line of code. And that assumes that there's even documentation available for us to know how to get started. Furthermore, as we're probably all experiencing right now, when you're working remote, it's possible that you don't even have access to sufficient hardware for you to be able to productively do the job you want to do. Maybe because you haven't got it yet, it's back ordered, or just it isn't available. And these things all add up to becoming friction for getting you going from zero to contribution. The second area that I want to talk about is collaboration. And we know that as teams are working quicker and looking to accelerate their release velocity, it becomes so important that they're constantly in sync and sharing and transferring knowledge so that they can move faster but thoughtfully as a group. Otherwise, what happens is you accumulate a vast amount of tribal knowledge, or you have all this feedback that gets pushed off way too late in the product cycle, and that ends up resulting in folks feeling like it's taking too long for their code reviews to get merged, or for them to get the understanding of a piece of the code base that they didn't actually understand, that they're now only getting maybe as PR comments. Finally, a lot of collaboration tools that we use today are not necessarily built with developers in mind. And so, for example, when we use things like screen sharing, while that can be very useful for remote collaboration, it doesn't necessarily allow each developer to retain their environment and the settings and their ergonomic setup that they've invested a lot of time in. And all of a sudden, they're now sharing or looking at somebody else's screen and effectively sacrificing the ergonomic and the visually familiar experience that they're very comfortable with. And so these two things, the cost of onboarding and the lack of tooling that inspires frequent collaboration, adds up to productivity challenges. And so really through the rest of this talk, what I want to get at is demonstrate how is it that we as developers can achieve more of this, where people join the team, take on a task, and are able to contribute meaningfully as quickly as humanly possible, and get away from this, where people are spending days or hours doing setup and just feeling like they're swimming upstream far too often. So what I want to do now is, for the rest of this discussion, kind of show what a day in the life might look like for a remote developer who is working on, in this case, an issue and leveraging some of the new tools and services that we've released recently. All right, so here I am on github.com, and as part of a team that I'm working on with other developers, we're building a guestbook application that is actually meant for build and is something that if folks are interested in, they can sign for this week. You'll notice that I have an issue that was assigned to me that indicates that the images on the guestbook aren't showing up. which is obviously pretty unfortunate because that is the entire point of the guest book. Now, I just got a brand new machine that I'm sitting on here talking with y'all today, and unfortunately, I don't have any of the dependencies installed that I need to work on this application. So if I type node-v, you'll notice there's nothing there. If I type npm-v, there's nothing there, right? And that's super sad because what that tells me is that I'm going to spend like the next 10 days basically setting up my environment just to get to the point where I can actually write a single line of code. But instead of me going and looking at the README of this project, what I'm going to do is use a new service that we just released called Visual Studio Codespaces. And what that allows me is to, with a single click, provision a new dev environment in the cloud that's automatically set up with all of the requirements needed for me to work on this code base. So you'll notice when I click that link, I came to the Codespaces management portal, pre-populated with the repository that I'm working on, give it a name, and you'll notice that I have the option to select the hardware capabilities that I actually need to work on this project. And so this speaks really well to the challenge of having insufficient hardware, where irregardless what I'm currently working on today, I now have at my disposal anything from a 2-core 4 gig RAM machine all the way up to 8-core 16 gigs of RAM. And I have the option for not only having a Linux-based environment, but also as of today, Windows environments as well. And so in this case, I'll go ahead and select standard Linux and hit create. Now what this is going to go do is spin up in the cloud a brand new dev environment running in Azure that's going to clone that code base, look at it, and then infer from it all of the requirements needed in order for me to start coding without me having to read a single line of documentation or fiddle with installations of SDKs at all. This takes about 30 seconds to a minute. And so to kind of jump ahead a little bit, I've already gone ahead and spun up another code space for the exact same repository. Now, one thing that some of you may be thinking is that, okay, cool, if there's a service that I can ask it to give me a new dev environment for a code base and it sets it up automatically, that all sounds great. But what about the time that we invest in making our environment feel like home? Feel like us, the way we look and feel in coding every day, right, to get in the flow. And so one thing that you'll notice as I switch into the code space here is that not only has this, what I'm looking at is Visual Studio Code, the full fidelity version of the editor running in my browser without any sacrifices or lack of fidelity from what I would experience if I was to open it up on my local machine. But furthermore, it's automatically been personalized to look and feel exactly like I want it. And so you'll notice that this theme that we have set up is the Quiet Light theme, which is exactly the theme that I'm used to using. And that's automatically been roamed thanks to VS Code's preference sync capabilities. Additionally, you'll notice that the icon set in the Explorer tree is also set to the SETI theme, which is what I'm used to using. If I open up the terminal, you'll notice that it's automatically set to the fish shell, which is my preference when I'm using Linux. Otherwise, if I'm on Windows, I love PowerShell. But even more so, this has also automatically roamed my dot files, which is a very common convention that people use to effectively codify the terminal aliases and common command line configuration that they use so that as they go from machine to machine, it's automatically set up for them. And so, for example, if I type CLS, you'll notice that that works, even though that is not a command that's built into Linux. I define that alias so that I don't have to type clear every time, and that's now automatically available for me. And so what's great about this is I clicked a button, I went from an issue into an environment, and it's immediately now available to me in a way that looks exactly how I want it. But what about actually starting to write some code and being productive beyond just visually familiar? So the other benefit of the Codespaces service is that it understands by looking at the code base how to prepare the environment for this repository. And so, for example, if you'll notice here, glaring in all of our eyes is this big red squiggle, which if I hover over indicates that, oh, I'm using a var here when I should be using let or const. And if I hover over that, click the light bulb, I can go ahead and fix that. And so this kind of indicates two things. First is that all of the language services that I might be familiar with are automatically available to me. But furthermore, that squiggle was actually coming from an extension, not from VS Code itself. In fact, it was coming from the ESLint extension, which if I go to the extension tab, you'll notice that that was installed. The reason that that happened is because within this code base, there's a file called dev-container.json, which is how the code base itself can define what are the extensions that this repo needs in order for anyone to be productive immediately without having to go read documentation to do it. Furthermore, you'll notice if we look in the dev-container.json, it also defines what's called a post-create command, and that indicates what shell scripts should be executed once this code space is provisioned to automatically prepare the environment for me to start coding. And so if you look over on the left, you'll see that in fact the node modules folder has been pre-populated, and that's because without me having to do anything, it automatically understood, the Codespaces service automatically understood and went off and ran that dependency restoration for me. Okay, so now I think we've kind of demonstrated that the Codespaces service spun me up in an environment, personalized it to look exactly the way I want, set it up based on the needs of the code base. But how do we actually go and repro this issue that we're trying to work on and see if we can't fix it? So as we discussed, this is a Node.js-based app. And so to start it up, what I would traditionally do is go to the terminal and simply run npm start. Now, because Codespaces provides a full-blown Linux container, I'm able to open the terminal and run anything that I would normally. And so here, I'm able to run npm start. But the thing that's a little bit interesting is you'll notice that in the terminal output, it says that the server is running on localhost 3000. But I'm viewing this application or this VS Code-based editor experience in the browser. I don't have anything running on localhost. And so how is that possibly going to work? Well, as I hover over, you'll notice that it says, hey, just hit Command-click to follow the link. So let's go ahead and do that. And what you'll see happens is that the Codespaces service automatically and securely forwarded the port of that application running inside of the cloud and made it available to me in my browser. And so you can see here is the GUID ID of the Codespace, followed by port 3000 and online.vs.com. And so this is pretty powerful because even though I've fully moved my developer environment to the cloud, I've actually not lost any experience that I would need in order to understand this issue. So here I'm able to see visually that in fact the images on the guest book are not correct. So let's kind of see if we can't figure out what's going on. Now, the first thing I want to do is do a little bit of debugging. So I'm going to switch to the debug tab and simply run the application. And I want to verify that the signature data is valid. And so if we do that, you'll notice I hit F5. And once again, even though I'm running entirely in a cloud-based developer environment that I didn't have to set up, I automatically can simply start the debugger and begin to work like I would otherwise. So if I hover over signatures, I can see here that, OK, we've got Satya, we've got Scott, we've got myself, Hanselman. OK, so the data seems to be valid. So I don't think it's an issue there. So I'll go ahead and continue the debugger. So I'm thinking that maybe there's an issue with the URL of the images. So I'll do a search for github.com. And there, in fact, I can see that there's a typo in the property name that we're using to populate the image href. So I'm going to make that change, hit Control S, and you'll notice that as soon as I did that, because this is a React.js-based application and it had a file system watcher, it automatically picked up my change, which then in turn automatically refreshed the application. And so here I can see that I just made the fix, which is great because I haven't had to change anything about my workflow, even though I didn't do any setup. So let's come back here, open up another terminal, and I'm going to do a git commit, because I'm pretty excited that I just made this fix, fixing images. And then furthermore, you know what? I'm going to just go ahead and push this thing straight to master because why not? I'm so excited about the productivity that I'm getting from Codespaces. So let's say git push origin master. And that's going to just immediately work because as part of the personalization that Codespaces does, it understood the identity that I've signed into the Codespaces service with and made available my Git credentials. And so what this kind of illustrates is that I went from an issue on GitHub, clicked one button, spun up an environment with exactly the needs from a hardware and setup perspective of the code base. It was fully personalized for me, and I was able to view, repro, fix, and push the change for that all within just a matter of minutes. Now, in this demo thus far, we've been showing the experience all from within the browser-based editor, but if I switch back over to VS Code Desktop and refresh my Codespaces tab, you'll notice that because I'm signed in to the desktop client with the same exact account as I was in the browser, I'm able to actually see the exact same Codespaces that I just created and was connected to. And so at this point, I could click Connect and join that and start working now from the desktop client. And starting today, as was just announced in this morning's keynote, I can also create Windows-based Codespaces and connect to those from the Visual Studio IDE client as well, which ensures that as a developer, I have the flexibility to not only work from anywhere, but from any of the clients within the Visual Studio family that I prefer. All right, so one last thing that I want to do is actually, now that I've fixed the guest book, I actually want to get my good friend Nick to actually sign it, because he actually did a lot of the work on this guest book. And before we launch this thing for the event, I want to go ahead and make sure he's represented. And so traditionally, when we think about developer collaboration, as we discussed earlier, we might turn to screen sharing and say, all right, let me pull Nick in. But unfortunately, his view of the world might be entirely different than mine. In fact, I believe he's using Visual Studio on Windows. As you can see here, I'm using Visual Studio Code in the browser on a Mac. He could be using a dark theme, I'm using a light theme, and there's all kinds of differences between our setup that makes it not as enjoyable to collaborate when you're losing all of those personalizations. And so instead, what I'm going to do is use something called LiveShare. And what LiveShare allows me to do is go and see my list of contacts. And so you can see here's Nick. And I'm going to just simply click invite to pull Nick into this session. And what that's going to do is effectively allow him to join into my collaboration session, but with both of us staying in our individual developer environments. And so you can see here that he's joining. All right, here we go. Nick just joined the session. And now we see Nick's cursor just automatically appear within the guestbook gridcell.js. And as he moves his cursor around and highlights text, that's going to automatically show up. You'll also notice on the right side that we have text chat. And so I can say, hey, Nick, want to sign the guest book? And because LiveShare provides chat directly in the developer tool, that allows us to collaborate without having to switch context or losing the precious, the immersive feeling of being within the editor. All right, so let's switch over to the Explorer tab, and I'm going to open up signatures.js. And as soon as I do that, you'll notice that Nick is still off in guestbook gridcell.js. And the reason that that's interesting is, unlike screen sharing, LiveShare allows two or more developers to collaborate on the same code base, but work either together or independently, depending on the situation at hand. And so in this case, Nick is still looking at the guestbook grid, even though I've moved on. That said, if I want to pull his attention to come look at this file with me, I can perform what's called a focus. And you'll notice as soon as I did that, his cursor jumped into the signatures file. And so Nick, what I want you to do is, this file indicates the guest book. And so I want Nick to go ahead and sign this with his GitHub handle and his location. And because LiveShare allows not only real-time shared cursors, but also co-editing, as you can see, Nick is able to actually perform the signing of the guest book by editing this JavaScript file entirely on his own. Now, furthermore, if we save this, what I want is for Nick to be able to see and understand the fact that this change actually worked. And so I'm going to pop open a new terminal. And what I'm going to do is actually make this terminal writable. That way, Nick, on his end, is able to access this. And so here you can see no hands. Nick is now typing inside of my terminal, making a War Games reference, which of course is hilarious, which indicates that the other benefit of LiveShare is not only that he and I are able to collaborate on the exact same code base using our own individual environment, but that it provides full context collaboration, right? Editing, shared terminals, presence, language services, and even debugging. So in fact, if I come and start a debugging session, you'll notice that we're paused on the breakpoint, and I'm actually going to have my hands up and ask Nick to go ahead and continue the debugger to step it forward. And then what should happen is you'll notice that now I'm no longer debugging. And the reason is because just like we saw with editing and shared terminals, Nick and I were actually in the same debugging session looking and viewing the same exact state. So to close this out, let me switch back to the Guestbook app, do a refresh. Actually, I forgot I stopped the session. So let me go back here, run npm start. It's already running. All right, sweet. Let me close this out, because what I want to see is that, in fact, the change that we just made to the Guestbook is, in fact, in place. So let me launch the application once again. Oh, npm start. Oh, and here we go. There's Nick right there in all of his glory with some kind of Muppet creature. All right, so with that, in recap, like, what did we primarily see? We saw kind of two primary things. The first is using Visual Studio Codespaces to enable easy onboarding to a project, literally going from a GitHub issue with one click into a full-blown cloud-based environment that's set up and personalized for you. We also saw the use of LiveShare, which enables a developer-friendly form of collaboration where two or more developers can work together without having to leave the comfort of their favorite IDE, but also being able to work independently and using the full extent of their favorite tools. So if you're interested in learning more about Codespaces or LiveShare, here are some links for you to go check out. Also, here's my contact information. But otherwise, I really appreciate folks joining in today. And now I'd love to take some questions and hear what folks are thinking about Codespaces or LiveShare.
Perfect. Thanks, Jonathan. So one of the questions that I've seen come in is Codespaces a GitHub-only feature?
That is a great question. It is not. So Codespaces is a general purpose service that allows you to spin up a cloud environment for any Git-based repo, or even you can choose not to specify a repo at all. I just happen to show it from a GitHub-based workflow because that is one commonly used version control. But if folks are using Azure DevOps or other version control solutions, you can go and use Visual Studio Codespaces today and get the exact same experience that I just showed.
Sweet. Another question that's coming up, people are asking about the dot files. How did those get linked into your code space?
Yeah, great question. I kind of glossed over it a little bit, but actually when you create the code space, there's actually a setting that you can specify. And let me go ahead and just kind of show that since it's a little bit easier. Where basically when you create a code space, you can specify an optional Git repo that defines your dot files. And so as you can see on my screen here, my GitHub username is Lost in Tangent, and then I have a repository called dot files that includes the scripts and the configuration necessary to prepare the environment. So by me simply specifying that, Codespaces did the work to clone it, run the scripts, and then prepare the environment for me.
Sweet. Antoine is asking if Codespaces requires an Azure subscription.
It does. So yeah, Visual Studio Codespaces is itself an Azure service. And so you will need to have an Azure subscription that you could have as part of your team. And that subscription could be a free trial, a student subscription. It could be a dev test subscription that you get as a benefit of a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription. But yes, once you have the Azure subscription, you'll then be able to create Codespaces as part of that, as part of your account.
And I'll also add, Antoine, to Jonathan's point, that means any credits that you have, whether that's from MSDN or Visual Studio subscription, you can apply that to Codespaces just like any other Azure service. So Jonathan, you showed off and mentioned that you're theme was available immediately when you logged in, are other settings available or sunken? Does that just work in the browser, or how does that interact with the desktop?
Yeah, good question. So actually, all of the Visual Studio Code settings are roamed. So that includes everything from your color theme, as I mentioned, also the icon theme. So the fact that you see this JS icon next to a .js file, that includes your Windows layout. So for example, if I was to hide the status bar and go to another code space or back to VS Code Desktop, it would automatically roam that preference. If I wanted to move the activity bar to the right side, and so all of that kind of UI state, as well as the installed extensions that I have, would automatically roam with me, because all of those things kind of contribute to the experience feeling familiar to you. And so the other thing I'll quickly call out is that all of that is actually configurable. And so actually I could kind of quickly show that. You'll notice here I just opened up the settings for roaming settings, and I have the option to specify, do I want to roam settings, keyboard shortcuts, snippets? I've actually turned off extensions. UI state is handling the roaming of window layout, etc., that I mentioned before. And so that way you have a little bit of control over predicting the behavior. And then, as I mentioned, this roaming will happen not only between the VS Code web experience, but also Visual Studio Code desktop as well.
Nice. And we're running short on time, so we'll maybe be able to squeeze in one or two more questions. There's a few different questions kind of asking about how do you pay for code spaces? Will code spaces be included in GitHub's enterprise plan? Maybe you could just speak a little bit to how people will be able to buy this.
Yeah, so similar to the question about needing an Azure subscription. So today, CodeSpaces is an Azure service. And so if you go create an Azure subscription, if you don't already have one, as part of that, there is a Visual Studio CodeSpaces plan, which is a resource in Azure, just like any other Azure resource. And that plan is then also the billing unit. So as you create CodeSpaces, basically you're paying per second for the time that you use the code space. And so to that point, actually, as I'm sitting here interacting with it, right, I'm using it, interacting with the environment. If I'm done with it, I could go ahead and disconnect from this. And if I wanted, I could either suspend the environment or delete it entirely. And that way, I'm only paying for the time for the code spaces that I am actually using. And so that said, to Nick's point a moment ago, also because this is an Azure service that you're paying for through Azure based on per second billing, that also means that you can use any of the Azure credits that you have from student offerings, Visual Studio subscription benefits to apply towards that. And then, yeah, that way it works effectively like any other Azure service.
Awesome. Thanks so much, JC. So we have 1 minute left, so maybe you can point people to where they can find out more information.
Yeah, so if you, if I bring back up this slide, if you go to aka.ms/VSCS, that's going to take you to the landing page for Visual Studio Codespaces. And from there, that'll link you off to our FAQ, to our documentation, and then a bunch of samples. Furthermore, if you go to ak.ms/VSLS, that's Visual Studio Live Share, that will help go ensure you can get the information you need for live share. So yeah. And if folks have feedback or more questions about either of those two services, please feel free to reach out to me either on email or on Twitter. Our team will be super excited to chat with folks over the course of the next 2 days, but also beyond.
Awesome. Well, JC, I really appreciate you taking the time to walk everybody through this. I know it's a super exciting feature to be on the team with you to work on, and hopefully everybody else is going to get some enjoyment out of it over the coming months and years. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, thanks everyone for tuning in.